Lewis Grassic Gibbon was born James Leslie Mitchell. He was the youngest of 3 children born to parents James Mitchell and Lilias Grant Gibbon. His mother, Lilias, was remembered by those who knew her as the family manager, efficiently handling the family's public business. She had reddish hair, which may have caught Leslie's attention while at church as he was looking at the pictures of the stained glass. Though not a pattern for Chris's mother, scholars believe that his posthumously published novel, The Speak of the Mearns, published in 1982, is a tribute to his forceful yet affectionate mother. The pseudonym he used when publishing works on Scotland was derived from her maiden name, Gibbon, and her mother's maiden name, Grassic, then spelled with a K. Most scholars believe Leslie Mitchell based the character of John Guthrie on his own father, who was also a farmer. Those who knew James Mitchell, the father, remembered him as reserved and taciturn. He seems to have shown little affection for his family in public. The cold, inaccessible, sometimes violent father figure is a common theme in many of Leslie Mitchell's works. Or Leslie to his friends and family and used the pen name J. Leslie Mitchell when he did not use the Scottish pseudonym. His reluctance to be known as James may demonstrate some of his personal feelings about his father. J. Leslie Mitchell was born on a small farm in Auchterless, Aberdeenshire. This is just north of where Sunset Song takes place. His parents were crofters, or farmers. Farming in Scotland was still feudal at the turn of the century. This meant that the land was owned either by the crown, a noble, a laird, which is a word for a Scottish chief, or by a wealthy landowner. Families could lease farms or work as few or fee laborers. This meant that they did not own their land, nor the buildings they reared on the land, their homes. Tenants could be turned out at the end of their lease. Tenants would pay a large sum at the beginning of their lease cycle in order to live on and farm the land. Often, the families could barely eke enough out of the land to pay the lease and buy enough food to survive. One poor crop could jeopardize a family's ability to pay their land tenure fees. When families were turned off of the land, they rarely had any significant savings. They might sell the furniture from their house or the gear of the farm in order to have enough money to start a new lease somewhere else. Of course, then they would be without furniture and without much of the gear needed to farm that land. The Mitchell family had to leave their place in Auchterless in 1907, when Leslie was 6 years old. They spent a year in the large city of Aberdeen. At the time, Aberdeen was an industrial city with large smoking industrial factories and small, cramped, densely populated living quarters for the city's inhabitants. Compared to the rolling hills and wide open spaces of Auchterless, his year in Aberdeen as a small child must have seemed both exciting and horrifying. Leslie Mitchell's dislike for the 20th century industrialization that scarred the Scottish landscape and employed Scottish peasants in toxic factories for long hours is clear in his descriptions of the fictional city within Grey Granite, the last novel of a Scott Square, as well as in essays he wrote for the Scottish Scene. He writes, "If I look out on the land of Scotland and see it fouled by the smoking slag heaps of industrialism, rightwards and leftwards, a long trailing rift down the eastern coast and a vomiting geyser in Lanarkshire, I feel no stirrings of passion at all to add to the tortured wastes of countryside Northumbria." In 1908, the family settled in the croft of Bloomfield near the town of Arbuthnot. Bloomfield stands today. It is a small bed and breakfast and is the private home of a retired couple. Its lands are still worked by neighbors and other farmers in the area. Locals describe Bloomfield as a good farm in a good year. However, much of the land is of poor quality. The soil is rocky and clayey. The land itself is exposed to wind, rain, and sun. In order to survive, the Mitchell family worked ceaselessly, sacrificing both body and mind to a land that ill provided them with subsistence. Leslie hated the hard lifestyle of crofting when he was young. He writes, "Once I had a very bitter, dark detestation for all this life of the land and the folk upon it. A gray life, dull and gray, and its routine, servitude to seasons and soil, and the attending of cattle, a beastly life." "50 yards down the road, past Bloomfield, is Harridan. This is the family home of Rebecca Ray Middleton, who would become James Leslie Mitchell's wife in the 20s. They were childhood friends. Here, Rebecca Ray Middleton lived with her father, Robert, who served as the pattern for Long Rob of the Mill in Sunset Song. The small town of Arbuthnot serves as the pattern for the Kinratty of Sunset Song. Leslie Mitchell attended school as a child at the Arbuthnot School and went to the kirk or the church with his family on Sundays. The church in Arbuthnot is still used for those purposes today. However, it is left open during the weekdays, so lovers of Sunset Song may wander in the aisles and see the very same windows and pews that inspired Lewis Grassic Gibbon. The figures on the stained glass that Lewis Grassic Gibbon describes in the prelude to Sunset Song can still be seen today. There are 3 figures of women by the window, Charity, Hope, and Faith. However, in Sunset Song, Lewis Grassic Gibbon has changed some of the details. These are the real windows in the church that Leslie attended as a boy. He describes them in Sunset Song, though the pictures are not perfect matches for the word. It had fine glass windows, awful old, the wee hall with 3 big creatures of queens, not very decent like in a kirk as window pictures. One of the queens was Faith. In Faith, she looked a daft like Keek, for she was lifting up her hands, and her eyes like a heifer choked on a turnip, and the bit blanket round her shoulders was falling off her, but she didn't seem to heed, and there was a swither of scrolls and fiddly faddles all around her. And the second queen was Hope, and she was near as unco as Faith, but had bright bonny hair, red hair, though maybe you'd call it auburn, and in the winter time the light in the morning service would come splashing through the yews in the kirkyard and into the wee hall through the red hair of Hope. And the third queen was Charity, with a lot of naked bairns at her feet, and she looked a fine and decent like woman, for all that she was tied about with such daft-like clouts. The ancient tower, described in the prelude, that is supposed to be part of the kirk or next to the kirk, but not actually part of the church itself, is probably based on the bell tower that was constructed around 1500 by Sir Robert Arbuthnot. This tomb that is in this tower contains the remains of James Arbuthnot, who's the son of Sir Robert, and probably figured as the pattern for the tomb of Cospatrick described in the prelude. The manse, or minister's house, was located behind the church. A small door from the back of the church led to a pathway up to the manse that would allow the minister to bypass the congregation or other visitors and hide away in his home when his services were needed. This too has been described in Sunset Song. Across from the church, you can find the remains of the old Arbuthnot Mill and the house that had once existed there. Now these buildings are derelict. However, you can also see this large pleasant stream that's called the Burvey Water that allowed the mill to spin. The towns of Inverbervie and Stonehaven also provide important settings for sunset song. Inverbervie is a coastal town only a few miles from Arbuthnot. Stonehaven, where Chris and Ewan later go for a dip in the sea, is another pretty coastal town, about 15 miles north of Arbuthnot. There's one important setting in Sunset Song for which we have no contemporary pictures. This is the loch and the standing stones, supposedly near Blairgowrie, to which Chris often returns. The loch, or lake, has long since been drained and turned into arable land. While there are many historic sites of small standing stones near Arbuthnot, none of the remaining monuments appear to correlate exactly with Gibbon's description. It was common practice for farmers to dig up the stones in the way of their plows and either destroy them or use them for foundations and floorings for their outbuildings. Let us return briefly to Arbuthnot Kirk, the Kirk of St. Turnin. In one corner, as far from the church as you can get of the churchyard, sits the grave for James Leslie Mitchell. Leslie Mitchell died suddenly in 1935 from a stomach complaint. His remains were cremated, and Ray, his wife, brought them from London to have them buried in the Kirk's graveyard. Because Leslie had such a difficult relationship with the church and with religion, Ray refused to have a traditional church funeral, and instead, joined by just a few friends, she had his ashes buried simply and without ceremony. The disapproving locals, ever bitter over Mitchell's unflattering portrayals of them in Sunset Song, were not pleased by what they felt was a lack of respect and proper religious behavior in regards to their most literary, but maybe not most liked, son. James Leslie's father's tomb is right next to Leslie's. James Mitchell Sr. died a little over a year after his son, and his tomb was erected by his wife, Lilias, Leslie's mother. It seems only fitting that we should end this tour of Lewis Grassic Gibbon's Kinratty, or James Leslie Mitchell's Arbuthnot, with the beginning of Sunset Song. Below and around where Chris Guthrie lay, the June moors whispered and rustled and shook their cloaks, yellow with broom and powdered faintly with purple. That was the heather, but not the full passion of its color yet. And in the east, against the cobalt blue of the sky, lay the shimmer of the North Sea that was by Burvey. And maybe the wind would veer there in an hour or so, and you'd feel the change in the life and strum of the thing, bringing a streaming coolness out of the sea. But for days now, the wind had been in the south. It shook and played in the moors and went dandering up the sleeping grampians. The rushes pecked and quivered about the loch when its hand was upon them. But it brought more heat than cold, and all the parks were fair parched, sucked dry, the red clay soil of Blairgowrie gaping open for the rain that seemed never coming. Up here, the hills were brave with the beauty and the heat of it, but the hayfield was all a crackling dryness, and in the potato park beyond the biggings, the shaws dropped red and rusty already.